So many people, including smart people, think that there are too many people in the world and think that the population is growing out of control. It's completely the opposite. If people don't have more children, civilization is going to crumble.
That was Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, and by some accounts, a genius. What he gets so very wrong.
Plus, a smorgasbord of assorted growth-busting news next.
Calling. Call a GrowthBuster. Whoa.
This is the GrowthBusters podcast, where we hold your hand as you come to terms with limits to growth. We've outgrown the planet. We've hit the limits and gone beyond. That rubber band is going to snap back, and we'd best figure out how to shrink the scale of the human enterprise before Mother Nature does it for us. I'm Stephanie Gardner, GrowthBusters board member, environmental law and policy wonk, and sustainable energy nerd.
And I'm Dave Gardner, director of the documentary GrowthBusters, Hooked on Growth, and founder and senior fellow here at the Center for Busting Pro-Growth Mythology. You'll find us at growthbusters.org. You can search for GrowthBusters on Facebook, Twitter, and, of course, your podcast app for the latest in growth-busting news. We're recording this episode on December 22nd.
While Elon Musk headlines this episode, I've had quite enough of these space billionaires. So we're going to visit a number of recent noteworthy news items in this episode. But first, feedback from you guys, the listeners.
Yeah, and it's always interesting, isn't it, Steph?
We love getting feedback.
Yeah, it's really great. I want to share with you an email we got from Todd. And this is in reference to the last episode, which was World Leaders Cop Out. Todd wrote, I'm not trying to be a dick, but I couldn't help but notice Paul Sutton's supposed green fix of trading in one electric car for another, while he chooses to take a sabbatical in Australia, which involves a carbon footprint from air travel that's probably more than I use in 3 years. As to the proposed solution of a general strike to curb climate emissions, the real issue, as I mentioned above, is that no one wants to change their non-negotiable lifestyles, and nonsensical magic green solar panels and electric cars are only futile attempts at sustaining the unsustainable. So, sign petitions and have strikes and move around the deck chairs on the Titanic, because even at this late stage, to me, it looks like nobody's talking about the real elephant in the room. And as always, thank you so much for your thought-provoking podcast. I'm sorry for being critical, but if we're going to really change things, that involves severe compromises in personal lifestyles that most are unwilling to make. And Todd followed up a day later with this quick email. And on a philosophical note, what a dilemma we face, where we are intelligent enough to see we are rapidly destroying our planetary home, know what needs to happen to mitigate that, and yet we seem powerless to change the behavior of the person we see in the mirror. So I am back to my default of having compassion for the human condition and enjoying these remaining good days. Happy solstice.
Wow, that's great feedback from Todd. Really appreciate the level of personal analysis that he did and thinking about these tough issues.
Yeah, when Paul talked about flying to Scotland, we sort of gave him a little bit of a bye because he combined that trip with a family visit. I kind of found myself thinking in the back of my mind, well, that's still a huge footprint, and we'll probably hear from somebody about this too, which we did.
Yeah, absolutely. We all have to make those awkward trade-offs in our own decision-making, and I think it's important to think about this. So thanks for bringing this up, Todd.
Yeah, and Todd wasn't the first person to be critical of just how many people flew to Glasgow for COP26. That was a huge carbon footprint, and it does kind of make you wonder if we really are in the emergency we really are in. Why aren't we acting like it's a real emergency? Because I think the emergency response would be these COP meetings are going to just have to be virtual.
Yeah, maybe we need to shut down all air travel, and that's just the sacrifice humanity needs to make while we get all of this under control.
That's the level of urgent action that's needed, but we just can't. We humans just can't bring ourselves to admit that. Yep.
And I think it's also worth pointing out that if we had a planet with 1 billion or 2 billion people, then maybe our carbon budgets or our lifestyle budgets, hopefully not based on carbon in the future, would allow us more luxuries.
Yeah, undoubtedly. I'm glad you brought that up, because there's no question that being at 8 billion or more people, that just puts you on the very edge where the smallest mistake can be catastrophic. There was a lot more margin for error when there were a lot fewer of us on the planet.
I agree.
We do love to hear from you, and we have a new way to share your thoughts with all of us GrowthBusters. You can leave us a voicemail message, and that way, Stephanie, if it's smart and relevant, we can actually play the message on the podcast and hear the voice of the GrowthBuster who's giving us feedback.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this. I hope we get some people calling in.
Yep, that's pretty cool. 719-402-1400. You can also still email us at podcast@growthbusters.org, or post a comment to our videos at the GrowthBusters YouTube channel or on the GrowthBusters Facebook page. Now, for that smorgasbord we promised, usually just a short segment of the podcast, but this episode is just full of it.
So I came across a couple of climate updates related to the polar regions that I thought were really relevant to share. On December 14th, a team of 111 scientists from 12 countries released the 16th annual Arctic Report Card. So this is something they've been doing for 16 years, and the report essentially assesses the Arctic's vital signs. You can kind of think of it as an annual checkup with your physician. This just happens to be for the Arctic. Mm-hmm. So Matthew Druckenmiller, who is one of the scientists involved, he's based at the University of Colorado Boulder, highlighted a few aspects of this newest report on MSN Weather. So I wanted to just pull out a couple of those data points to share. So including data from 2021, 15 of the lowest summer sea ice extents have all occurred in the last 15 years, with a record dating back to 1979. And ice thickness is thinning at an alarming rate. Sea ice is really critical for both global climate temperature. It actually sort of acts as a cooling mechanism for the entire planet. So if that's not cooling sufficiently, there's impacts on lower latitude weather systems, like increased heat waves, droughts, and all of the extreme storms that we've been experiencing. And then there's also these crazy impacts on local Arctic weather. The summit of the Greenland ice sheet, which is over 10,000 feet above sea level, experienced its first ever observed rainfall in August of this year. So this place on Earth has only ever gotten snow, got rain for the first time this summer.
Jeez.
Just a sign that we are really altering our climate in a crazy way. And it's predicted that the Arctic could shift from a snow-dominated to a rain-dominated system when we hit 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. And as we've shared in recent episodes, we've already warmed our planet 1.2. So we're really on this weird cusp of completely altering how the Arctic system works.
Wow, it makes me think maybe we should consider changing the color of the upholstery on the Titanic deck chairs.
Yeah, that sounds real smart. And then, as the Greenland ice sheet melts, more water is being dumped into the Arctic Ocean, sea level rise. We all have heard all about that. And the article, I think, does a great job of pointing out some local impacts. I mean, there are people that live in the Arctic, and they're experiencing flooding, landslides. They've seen a huge increase in marine garbage from the increased shipping activity in Arctic waters. And this is a largely indigenous population up there. So extreme changes that are being experienced up north.
Wow. Well, thanks for sharing that. We'll put links in the show notes to that, right?
Yeah.
And I know we promised you at the top that we'd be talking about space billionaire Elon Musk, even though Stephanie's had enough of that. And he's coming up, but we've got a few other news bits before we slide Elon into the growth busting news.
Yeah,
what else
we'll keep you on the edge of your seats.
Yeah.
So looking toward the south in the Antarctic region, the New York Times had an article published on December 15th titled Rising from the Antarctic, A Climate Alarm by Henry Fountain and Jeremy White. And I found this to be very interesting and educational because I just didn't quite understand how the Southern Ocean worked. But apparently there's this Antarctic circumpolar current, which is the largest current in the world. It can extend up to 2 miles deep and as wide as 1,200 miles. And it essentially acts as the world's climate engine. So it's kept the world from warming even more by drawing deep water from the Atlantic, Pacific, Indian Oceans. Much of this water has been submerged for hundreds of years. It literally hasn't touched our atmosphere for hundreds of years. And it kind of is upwelled to the surface where it can exchange heat and carbon dioxide with the atmosphere before it kind of keeps flowing in the this perpetual flow around the globe. And so by some estimates, the oceans have taken up about 25% of our excess carbon dioxide, as much as 90% of our excess heat.
Jeez.
Since basically industrialization in the 19th century. So these scientists have basically been able to learn a lot more about this Antarctic current recently because of better technology. They have these floating probes that can kind of go to different depths and collect data, and then they beam it back when they're at the surface. And so the latest news that they've shared based on all this collected data is that the warming of the planet has sped up this deep ocean water coming to the surface. And what that means is it could end up releasing more carbon than it absorbs. And then additionally, as the water warms, it melts the floating Antarctic ice. And that could pave the way for ice that's on Antarctica, the landmass, to flow into the oceans and cause sea level rise. So there's kind of a new flurry of research around this, and not good news on the Antarctic front.
Shoot. All right. Well, thanks for sharing that, I think.
Yeah, sorry to share the bad news. But I mean, I think the point of this is we are changing the climate in big ways. And we've known this for many decades. It's just going to keep getting more and more severe and getting to these tipping points that we can't turn back from. So it's so critical that we make big changes ASAP.
Yeah, for years we've been getting, the IPCC reports, which require a consensus of so many people that they couldn't help but be watered down. So, we've had watered down warnings, and it turns out that even the true research behind them, I think, is being surprised a little bit. I think even that has underestimated some of these impacts.
Yeah, that's my sense too.
Yeah. So not good. Do you have any good news for us?
Yeah, I think we do have some good news to share this episode, which is always helpful and hopeful. We came across a piece in the Indian Express titled "Population Slowdown is Triumph of India's People." And this was written by Poonam Mutreja. She gave a little historical background about population policies in India, which I had no idea about. Everyone's heard about the one-child policy in China, but India actually had one of the first family planning programs in the 50s.
Yeah, and there was definitely some ugly stuff that happened with forced sterilization in India, which a fair number of sustainable population activists and critics know about. But the details she provided were quite illuminating, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the original family planning program in the 50s was not this forced sterilization mechanism. It was just encouraging smaller families, but that didn't work. And so then the sterilization happened in the mid-70s, and there was a big backlash. The public really didn't like those coercive policies, and that government was voted out. And then governments were kind of afraid to even touch the topic for the following decades. But Poonam is really focusing in this article on the current situation, which is that the total fertility rate has decreased to 2 in the latest National Family Health Survey from almost 6 in the 1950s.
This is for the whole country.
For the whole country.
India. Yeah.
And so that's a huge improvement. And she argues that women's aspirations and exposure to media has contributed to that lower fertility rate, and that this is a real accomplishment for the country.
What's cool is that, now this was a column, not really a news story, because Poonam is executive director of Population Foundation of India. So not too surprising that somebody like that would really have their finger on the pulse of the planet and the real facts about overpopulation. But still, it was so nice to see a piece that, so rare, that characterized falling birth rates as something to celebrate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. In fact, just one sentence I want to share, or 2 sentences, actually. This drop in India's TFR, which stood at almost 6 in the 1950s to its current levels, is a significant feat. The credit for this achievement must go to the people of India, along with successive governments, especially the bureaucracy. So it's characterized as an achievement, as it should be everywhere that it's happening.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very cool. So kudos go out to the Executive Director of Population Foundation of India and to the people of India for doing the right thing. You know, Stephanie, we talked in the last episode about a Pew Research study that was digging into why growing numbers of young adults are delaying having children, having fewer children, or choosing to be child-free for life. Well, there was a similar study by Morning Consult back in September. We'll put a link in the show notes. And it got the attention of the writers at The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. So they came up with this.
Introducing Trojan's most effective birth control yet. Buzzkill condoms. Imagine you and your lover in front of a cozy fire. Lou Rawls is playing low in the background. You've each had a few drinks and you're in the mood. That's when it's time to reach for a Trojan Buzzkill. Because inside each package is a stark global warming fact like July 2021 was the hottest month ever recorded. Who would risk bringing a child into that world? So when you start rising like the world's sea levels, reach for a Buzzkill and shrink like the glaciers.
Well, no sex is one way to do it.
Yeah, I didn't personally think that this hit home or resonated in the right way. I think condoms are a good thing that should be encouraged because even though they might not be entirely effective, they are pretty effective and an important tool that we have at our disposal to help, keep our population in check, avoid unintended pregnancies. So I think that, maybe the buzzkill are those impacts of climate change and you go and you reach for the condoms. The condoms themselves shouldn't be discouraging using condoms.
Yeah. And you rose to their defense. And if they're used correctly, then they are not quite 100% effective, but a whole lot more effective than the rate of effectiveness based on the fact that apparently for some reason they're used incorrectly way too often. But I want to just also put in a good word for vasectomies because I'm pretty sure they're 100% effective, and they're generally reversible. But, we men, it's quick, it's easy, it's pretty inexpensive, weighs in much more favorably than the permanent arrangements that women have to make in order to not have to use a condom or something like that. And it is kind of a pain. There are other ways. If that bothers you, and it bothers men, I think, more than women. If it bothers you, get a vasectomy. And there are other long-acting forms of contraception that are available to us as well, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think on the bright side here, Colbert putting attention on this topic in sort of mainstream media is huge.
Yeah, it's a good thing.
Yeah.
What's next?
I don't know, but I'm glad we're moving on because there's nothing more awkward than talking about condoms with your dad. I think we're on to Elon.
Well, we are, but before we do, I think we should take a quick break. This episode's coming out at the end of the year, and a lot of people are thinking about their charitable giving. So I would just like to put in an appeal if you like what Stephanie and I are doing or some of the other GrowthBusters projects, or you can't wait to see what we do next, then we could use your help. So head over to growthbusters.org and click on that donate button.
Yeah, that would be a great way to include an important organization and project in your year-end giving.
So I thought we were kind of done with space billionaires, but then Time Magazine went and had to name Elon Musk the person of the year. And because it's Elon and because of some of the things he's done and said, we just couldn't leave that alone. There's a lot of good reasons for him to be this noteworthy. He's the richest man in the world. His net worth is close to $300 billion. He built Tesla into the most valuable U.S. automaker, worth multiples of Ford and GM, valued at about $1 trillion today. He is revolutionizing space travel with SpaceX. He has tens of millions of Twitter followers who hang on his every word. And he's been able to do what NASA couldn't, reusable rockets. Plus, he almost single-handedly proved that EVs can take over the world. He had a double major in physics and economics, and we found out from that Time story about him that his mom started it. They called him that genius boy. It was pretty clear early on that this guy had some brains. However, in an interview in early December with the Wall Street Journal's Joanna Stern at the CEO Council Summit, he made a couple of statements, Stephanie, that bring into question just how much of a genius he is. First, when he was asked about Joe Biden's Build Back Better infrastructure bill, he didn't think the bill was really a good idea. When pressed about what kind of infrastructure he thought does need attention, he mentioned better airports and highways, but then devoted most of his answer to this.
Especially in cities that are congested, we've got to do something to deal with the extreme traffic, which I think is some combination of double-deckering freeways and building tunnels. But if we don't do something, we will be stuck in traffic for forever. As autonomous vehicles come to the fore, and it's easier to drive without going through the pain of having to drive yourself, which is absolutely coming and will be one of the biggest transformations ever in human civilization. There will be more cars on the road, and the traffic will get much worse.
Wow.
And that's our genius boy? Really?
Wow. I keep saying this. I feel like he is just so out of touch. I think the best cities in the world, they have fantastic public transit. They have great trains to get you to where you want to go. And those are the things that solve traffic, not adding more private vehicles onto the road.
I can't believe that that's his vision, is that there are going to be more vehicles because of autonomous technology. That's pretty sad. And really double-deckering freeways and tunnels, that's the best that this smart guy is going to come up with. I mean, that is old shit. Yeah,
and it's adding to the existing problem. It's not creating a solution.
Yeah.
It's very misguided and kind of frustrating, honestly.
Well, no wonder he wants to colonize Mars just to get out of the traffic.
Apparently.
Mars, there's no traffic up here. No oxygen either.
Plenty of air conditioning, though.
Yeah. Well, if that's not bad enough, later on in this interview, when he was asked about AI and robots solving labor shortages, here is what he had to say.
The fundamental constraint is labor. There are not enough people. I can't emphasize this enough. There are not enough people. And I think one of the biggest risks to civilization is the low birth rate and the rapidly declining birth rate. It is, and yet so many people, including smart people, think that there are too many people in the world and think that the population is growing out of control. It's completely the opposite. Please look at the numbers. If people don't have more children, civilization is going to crumble. Mark my words.
Is this why you have so many children?
I'm trying to set a good example. Yeah. Gotta practice what I preach.
Well, this guy's pretty deluded, and I think we need to fact check him for sure. And we're not the only ones, right?
Yes.
Right off the bat, I want to make sure anyone who has heard Elon Musk talk about there not being enough people and worrying about human civilization crumbling because the birth rates are getting lower and lower, you need to know that the human population on the planet is growing today. It's growing by numbers as big as ever. We're adding about 80 million people to the planet every year. That's another Germany worth of people added to the planet every year. So we're far from being in danger of extinction, that's for sure. And with 8 billion people today, roughly, even if we drastically cut the fertility rate that's already on its way down anyway, we would still number in the billions in 100 years. I mean, it would take us hundreds of years to even get anywhere close to a number where we might have to think about, gee, do we need to boost our fertility rate back up to 2.1 in order to perpetuate ourselves? I mean, that is just not even a discussion that needs to be had in our lifetime or the lifetime of our kids.
Absolutely. And he talks about civilization is going to crumble. I think our civilization is going to crumble because of the destruction on the planet.
Too many people.
That's what I would be worrying about if I were Elon Musk.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, if everybody in the world decided that they needed to have 6 kids like Elon, then we would crumble instantly.
I agree.
Yeah, the planet cannot support that kind of demand. Probably preaching to the choir here, but we're deep into overshoot. And we're so deep into it. We're basically, according to the best data out there from the Global Footprint Network, we're very close to 2-planet living today. And that's the global average. Those of us in the overdeveloped world are living more like we had 5 or 6 planets. That is each year chipping away at our life support systems. It would be as if we were on a spaceship and every day somebody took out a screwdriver and unscrewed some panel off of the spaceship and ate it. How long can you keep doing that?
Not forever.
Yeah. With each passing day, your spaceship is less capable of supporting life.
Yeah, so huge kudos to Population Matters communications manager Olivia Nader, who wrote a piece called Elon Musk is Wrong. We Need Smaller Families. And I really liked this piece. I thought it did a great job of summarizing the many ways in which Elon is very wrong. And I kind of pulled out a few highlights that I thought were really poignant. Number 1, and you already touched on this, Dad, the population is still growing. The UN predicts there is a 1 in 4 chance that our population will stabilize at 11 billion by 2100. That's the current UN projections just for stabilization. So we are going to be adding another 3 billion people until we maybe hit some sort of plateau, unless we do something drastic to change that course.
Now, there's a possibility that Mother Nature is going to do something before we get to that point, too. I mean, it's not a sure thing. But you're right that the widely heralded, discussed population trajectory, does call for the bad news of heading up to 11 billion before there's any stabilization. I seriously doubt Mother Nature is going to let us do that, but that's beside the point.
I agree, but is Elon not reading this information? Where is he getting his info?
I don't know. I think he's living in an Airstream trailer in the middle of South Texas somewhere. He must not have internet.
This piece also mentions that in the few countries where growth has stopped, we can implement policies and models that don't rely on perpetual growth. And that's something that we will have to start doing in some of these countries where fertility rates are lower. And there are policies today that exist, and these countries should be models for how to do that successfully. And then even if technology could make our planet habitable for as many people as we can cram without nature, is that desirable? Is it equitable to the other species on the planet? Isn't there some sort of ethical question here that Elon Musk is missing?
Yeah, good points all. A couple of things that really caught my fancy in this piece by Olivia. She wrote, more billionaire babies and a push to reverse the hard-won decrease in the global fertility rate are the opposite of what the world needs right now. And she also wrote, because of claims like Musk's and widespread media coverage about baby busts, many people now think that our population has stopped growing. We've got our work cut out for us. And we're going to talk about this episode after episode of the podcast. We just got to keep thinking of interesting ways to say it so that our faithful listeners don't say, heard it already, enough. If you feel like this is a little bit repetitive, and it is a little bit, the thing to do if you're one of our faithful listeners is to share this episode of the podcast with 6 friends. Every time you get a new episode, think of 6 new people that you want to share this episode with. I know on my iPhone, I can pull up any podcast or podcast episode and click the share button and then click text message and send a text message to somebody that recommends that they listen to this podcast. There's a link there. They click on that and it opens up the podcast app and boom, they get enlightenment. Yeah,
that's a great way to counteract this Elon Musk interview, among many other things that we hear about all the time. I can't leave this article without mentioning the point that Olivia raises, that women are not baby factories, and many don't have the desire or the means to have a large family. And this is another example of Elon being so out of touch. Can you imagine how expensive it is to raise 8 kids? He has that ability because he has all of this money, but most people don't. That's very challenging. And even if you could, even if you had the means to do that, is that desirable? I want to ask this hypothetical question. What if Elon Musk were a woman? Would he, or I guess she, would she be raising these children? Or, I think it kind of goes to gender equity and the household and, who is responsible for child raising?
It was interesting that Time magazine, the interview with him, there was a nanny, coming and going. He's handing his kid off to a nanny whenever he needed to do business. Every now and then he has to turn in a wife for a new one because he wore the last one out making babies.
Yep.
Come on, Elon. If you're a boy genius, you've got to know better that, we can't continue overpopulating the planet and just add more lanes of traffic. And Olivia wrote this very importantly. Musk and his fellow space baron billionaire Jeff Bezos are so invested in capitalist consumerism and seemingly obsessed with dystopian sci-fi futures that they view this planet as just another resource for us to maximally exploit before we move on to others. And Elon Musk seems to be more of that than anyone. I mean, he's got a vision of 1 billion people colonizing Mars. And you just think about it. You look at Mars, Mars has nothing. There's no reason to be there.
Other than it's the only planet we can maybe get to in a
yeah.
reasonable amount of time, which I think is like 9 months.
We've seen
one way.
Yeah. I mean, it'll be a fascinating scientific journey, but we've seen pictures of it. I mean, there's no reason to be there. There's so many places on planet Earth where there's great reasons to be here besides money, besides jobs. There are beautiful mountains to climb and beautiful views and lakes and rivers to fish and swim and kayak and great hiking and beautiful grasslands and animals of all types. You can enjoy their beauty and it all works together. There's none of that. I think we already know there's basically none of that on Mars. So we colonize Mars. You're just going to spend your whole life inside a manufactured dwelling.
Breathing recirculated air,
yeah.
Drinking recirculated water and urine.
I guess the best you can hope for is you're going to meet somebody that you can fall in love with and you have some relationship there. And of course you can continue to educate yourself. You can read and learn. But that's it. It's just, is that really the only future possible? Is there not another future where humankind figures out how to live in balance with the great, beautiful, abundant resources that we have here on this planet, where we don't burn them all up, but we use just enough that the planet can regenerate them and keep us alive year after year after year? Just asking. Well, some people have sort of tried to answer that question a little bit. James Pethokoukis, and I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right, an economic analyst with the conservative-leaning American Enterprise Institute. And I'll just tell you, anything that comes from the American Enterprise Institute is suspect in my view, because that is the ultimate growth pusher think tank. But James wrote, when he was analyzing this view of Musk's about space colonization, it is a view that says the solution to man's problems is growth and technological progress and maximizing human potential. Really? If that's the best we can do, then take me now. And then one other thing, it wasn't in the Time magazine story, but it was in Time magazine, a quote from Yuri Milner, who is the founder of DST Global. Suppose that in the year 3000, Time publishes the 100 most influential people of the millennium, who from our generation would make the list. Elon Musk has a shot because he is one of the few people who is not only thinking about the long-term survival of our civilization, but also doing something about it, building the conditions for a viable colony on Mars.
I would like to hear the opinions of the people that aren't leading these giant tech companies, don't have millions and billions of dollars, what do they think is the best use of our brightest geniuses and our technology and maximizing our human potential? I want to ask the 50% of people on this planet that live with less than $8 a day to live on. Is that the biggest problem that they think needs to be solved, getting to space, or is it something else? I mean, maybe this would be a good topic for one of your sidewalk interview videos where you go out and just ask people. It just seems like people have woken up to the fact that we have some very urgent, short-term, local things that we need to deal with.
Well, I think those bore Elon. To his credit, he has said that the people that he thinks are important and that impress him are not people with the most money, but people who are thinking about human civilization and what steps can be taken. How do we improve human civilization? His idea of improving civilization is just completely bonkers, but I got to give him a little bit of credit for that. But I'm guessing for some reason the tough space stuff, the big picture stuff, is just a lot more important to him than...
I think he exists in this echo chamber that is just so disconnected from the troubles of everyday people around the globe. That's my impression.
Yep. He needs to walk a mile in someone else's shoes. Sorry, Elon, you got a lot of money. You could make a lot of difference. We'd love to inspire you to do something meaningful with it. I think space exploration is exciting and it's in our future and it's something we want to do. But with the idea of abandoning Earth because we've completely screwed it up, because the traffic is so bad. No, that's not it. That's not it. Okay, well, we should move along.
All right. So this one was interesting, and I actually noticed this because I use Google Maps to navigate sometimes, and I had noticed that in Google Maps, they now are showing you the greenest route that you can take, and I believe that's based on the number of miles. The fewer miles you travel, the more green your potential route would be. And it turns out that Google has kind of released a series of features related to sustainability. And so Tree Hugger had some great coverage written by Sammy Grover of some of these new features, including maps, flights, investment portfolios, and Nest thermostats. The main focus of this article is on the Google Flights, which now show CO2 emissions for specific flight itineraries. It will show the emissions relative to other itineraries and allows you to sort the available itineraries by emissions. And it will also adjust the emissions based on allocation by seat, which this part in particular I thought was something that I don't think I'd ever thought about. But a first class or business class seat has more allocated emissions, because if you think about it, if every seat on a plane were a first class seat, you would only be able to fit a fraction of the people. So the goal of this feature is to allow users to see the impact. And you might think like, oh, well, what's the big difference between these different itineraries? Apparently, researchers at the International Council on Clean Transportation have found that emissions can vary as much as 80% between itineraries connecting the same destinations. So it seems like this could be a really powerful tool for people that are choosing to fly to minimize the impact they're having in terms of their CO2 emissions. So what do you think about this, Dad? Is this a good thing? Do you think that this would have an impact on people? And more broadly, do you think labeling things with emissions could be a powerful tool?
Well, I was pretty excited to learn just about the Google Flights thing, that you can actually start there. You don't log into United Airlines or Southwest Airlines or American Airlines. You just go to Google and put in where you want to go and the date you want to go and let Google start so that you can then sort by carbon footprint. And then the results that you get, you can click the link on the best carbon footprint option, and that'll let you book that flight. It'll take you to whatever airline's website. So that's pretty cool. But kind of circling back to your question, if you're driving in a car, you've got a dashboard in front of you. The main thing on the dashboard that you're taking note of is the speed that you're going, right? Because you're trying to...
Not get a ticket.
Not get a ticket. You're trying to be a good citizen and obey the law and not kill any pedestrians or bicyclists along the way. So you're constantly getting that feedback, and it allows you to behave well because you have that right in front of you. If you didn't have that, you would have to be guessing, and it wouldn't be front of mind either. And I really think that you need to have other things on the dashboard. Wouldn't it be neat if you had a carbon emissions meter on the dashboard so that if you had a lead foot and you were racing up to the next stoplight and then slamming on the brakes and sitting at a red light and then slamming down the accelerator when the light turns green and racing up to the next light, instead of playing the game I like to play, which is let's see how good a gas mileage we can get. Let's look ahead and coast up to the next red light if it's red and try not to even have to brake. I think more people would drive with a lower carbon footprint if they had that real-time feedback in front of them.
Yeah.
And this, is the next best thing, is being able to actually see what the estimated carbon footprint is of any itinerary that you choose. And, I've noticed one thing when looking for a flight itinerary, that frequently the cheapest itineraries have the most stops.
I wonder why that is.
Well, I think the airline's data system is, finding the flights that have less demand. If there's less demand, then they're going to sell those seats for less, and the direct flights are going to have more demand. So I experimented a little bit with Google Flights, and I was glad to see that wasn't necessarily always the case. Sometimes the low carbon footprint option was actually a very inexpensive option as well. But at least maybe having this information might get somebody to say, well, maybe I should spend an extra $100 and, not fly from Denver to Seattle to San Diego.
Yeah. And I think another point that was mentioned is that this could potentially influence the airlines themselves. If there is consumer demand or more consumer demand for lower carbon impact flights, maybe the airlines will start amending the way that they calculate or suggest itineraries. Of course, I think that there's a good group of people that are right when they say flying is never sustainable.
Yeah.
And we should avoid flying altogether.
Yeah, based on the nature of the climate emergency, we should just stop flying.
Yep.
For a long time, I guess, until we figure out the technology to allow us to fly without impact. And that kind of brings up, I don't want to go down too much of a rabbit hole, but you can't just fix these things with technology. And I kind of just hinted at a technological fix. The fact is that less flying is probably a long-term way to live in balance with nature on this planet. Just like using less energy. We cannot continue to use the amount of energy we use in the overdeveloped world and just change the source to wind and solar. There are serious questions about whether that reduces the carbon footprint at all. But, we have got to figure out a way to use less energy. And, of course, one way, not the only way, but one way is for there to be fewer of us using energy on the planet. That's got to be a part of the calculus.
Yep. So this feels like a positive, but it also feels like not nearly a large enough step that humanity needs to start taking towards solving the climate crisis and overshoot crisis.
That emissions data equips us to make smarter decisions and take some responsibility for our carbon footprint. But some people will argue that won't make much difference. It's the system that has to be changed. It's not individuals deciding whether to fly or not, or deciding to take the lower carbon footprint itinerary. And that was the subject of a recent interview that late-night comic Stephen Colbert did with Mother Earth. I'm going to play a little bit from his monologue that preceded his interview with Mother Earth. It turns out the interview wasn't all that noteworthy, but the setup that he did for the interview, I think, was.
Now, if you live on Earth, and I hope you do, then for years you've heard that the key fighting climate change is to reduce your carbon footprint. Reminds me of that famous parable. When you saw only one set of footprints on the beach, it was then that I picked you up in my Tesla. But turns out your footprint might not be the big one. Because since 1965, 20 companies have contributed 35% of all energy-related carbon dioxide and methane worldwide. And Chevron, Exxon, BP, and Shell are behind more than 10% of the world's carbon emissions. Who would have thought that oil companies would be bad for the environment after all they've done to barbecue the Gulf of Mexico? Well, I say it's time to stop. Those companies ought to be ashamed of themselves, unless they're a sponsor, in which case, knock it off maybe or maybe not. Thanks for the commercials. It's how I paid for my Tesla.
I'm glad that we're bringing this up and we're talking about this, because this is a really important, fundamental question that I think a lot of us grapple with. We have to figure out how to tackle everything together in order to make a change. So I guess weighing in with my personal opinion right off the bat is I think it's both. I think it's systemic and I think it's individuals, and they work in tandem. It's a feedback loop between the two. And so it has to be everything. But I do think that corporations have a lot more power, resources to make some very big changes, but it needs to be driven by individuals that are brave enough to kind of step up and do the right thing. And it needs to come from consumer demand. Consumer demand needs to change. So I kind of think it's an all of the above answer to this question.
Yeah, I got to just, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, just hit the basic obvious thing about these fossil fuel companies. You know, if we weren't all pulling up to the gas pump and buying gasoline, would these fossil fuel companies be responsible for so much of the carbon footprint?
No.
No. They depend on customers. They depend on customers. We're the customers. I just think we have so much more power than most people recognize, and way too many people are sitting around on their fat little fanny just waiting for government or corporations to fix things and not changing their own behavior, which is, it's a little harder, you know? And in fact, let's play this next part of Colbert's monologue that sort of gets to the heart of that, I think.
One other thing, and I mean this sincerely, I'm a huge hypocrite. I'll never do anything that's inconvenient to me. That's why there has to be systemic change, backed up by government action to make everyone make the right choices, not the easy ones. If it weren't for the government intervention, we'd still be eating lead paint chips dipped in fresh asbestos hummus and washing it down with cocaine colas. All of this has led scientists to conclude that there has to be regulation and that no amount of individual action will address the magnitude of the problem. But I still believe individuals should try to do their part.
Well, he saved himself a little bit with that last sentence.
Yeah, but I think that leads up to the interview with Mother Earth, and he's asking Mother Earth, what can individuals do? And her retort is like, oh, become the CEO of Shell and then change the company from within. So he's sort of taking a roundabout path to get to the same conclusion of a systemic change.
Yeah, but Mother Earth also mentions recycling. That's the first word out of her mouth. You know what? Recycling is such a tiny little blip. It's one of the easiest things in the world for you to do as an individual. So if you're not doing that, God help us. But that's just not anywhere nearly enough. And become a CEO of multinational corporation, I think there's a good reason to at least bring that up, because if the CEOs of multinational corporations were people who grew up in households and families that had a really strong conservation ethic, it would be more natural and easier for them to be leading their corporation down the right path.
I don't think that's necessarily true, because CEOs of public companies have this fiduciary duty to their shareholders to maximize profits. So there's some fundamental things that all lead back to our economy and capitalist economy.
Yeah, darn.
We always end up there, don't we?
Yeah, we do. But I thought that this raised an interesting question that I want to spend a minute with you on, Stephanie, and that is, is it true that we human beings are just not inherently good enough to do the right thing unless we're forced to?
Or it's made easy to do. I think that we are pretty fundamentally selfish. My guess is that that's a combination of our biology, our sort of biological imperative lizard brain, but also the cultural norms. What does our culture tell us is the right thing or the ethical thing? I think it's a combination of both. And I think that there are certain cultures that are much less selfish than, for example, the American culture that we live in.
Well, that tells you that we're capable of being altruistic.
To a degree, I think, yeah.
Part of the problem is that I think for the last 100 years, we have been programmed to expect very little of ourselves. We've been told over and over again that we are selfish and that we will do what we think is in our own economic best interest. So I think it has probably actually led us to evolve backward, into potentially less altruistic beings, which I think is sad. I'd like to see us expect more of ourselves.
That would be nice.
But it's true. The state of human civilization today is such that we're going to have carbon pricing and government regulation. Yeah. But, government regulation is us all getting together and agreeing we need to all agree to abide by this set of rules. It's us. A lot of people don't think the government is us, but it is, right?
That's the idea.
Or the ideal. That kind of reminds me of a conversation we had in the kitchen just the other day. You had shared that you had a friend who was, she and her husband were planning a trip. Honeymoon trip. And she's got a really strong conservation ethic. Yep. And she was feeling guilty about the potential of getting on an airplane and flying a long distance for this trip.
Yeah, absolutely. That, and as well as the cultural implications of potentially traveling to another country and maybe participating in ecotourism or in some way taking advantage of local people that are now, hugely dependent on tourism. And is that the best thing for that locale? I mean, there's just so many kind of ethical questions that she's been dealing with around this potential trip. And then on the other side, her husband is saying like, well, you know what, of all the things on the planet happening right now, us taking one flight is a very, very small drop in the bucket. Like, it's not going to move the needle. It's not going to make a difference if we take this trip.
And my wife was in the kitchen with us, and she immediately added, yeah, if those two don't book a flight, is that flight not going to go? And so, I bells rang in my head. I said, we got to talk about this, because apparently a lot of people don't really recognize the power of numbers. And this kind of relates to bystander behavior, which is something I did a documentary about years ago. And so I learned from some experts about that. And part of the problem is diffusion of responsibility. People don't recognize that in order for a lot of people to do the right thing, it requires a bunch of individual decisions to do the right thing. And so if you decide not to do the right thing because, wow, it's just us, well, is that the decision being made by a million other people? Wouldn't it be great if a million people made the decision, hey, we're not going to fly? And you know what? If that happened, then that flight wouldn't go.
Yep.
The airlines would be scheduling fewer flights if there was less demand.
Totally agree.
Now, that flight next week might still go, but that flight in 3 months would be off the schedule. We have so much power. So it just drives me nuts to think that there are a bunch of people out there thinking, well, my individual actions don't make a difference, because they add up, they multiply.
Agreed.
Okay, moving right along. Listen to this.
At a distant end of the earth, hidden somewhere on the remote Australian island of Tasmania, a strange structure is about to witness and record the end of the world as we know it.
That's the opening to a news story on the Cosmos News channel on YouTube. This news about this black box, I think, is interesting because it seems as though, at least the way that news about it has been presented by a few organizations, is that people are acknowledging that human civilization is going to crash. So we need a black box to record the data, just like there's black boxes on airplanes. So if they crash, people can analyze the data and find out what happened. Why did the plane crash? And so it would be valuable to have this data so that anthropologists, I suppose, in some future would be able to access this black box and say, wow, what happened to those 8 billion nutcases that were roaming the planet?
Yeah, this must be the Elon Musk Martians, right? They're the ones.
Yeah. They return from Mars and say, wow, where did everybody go? Surprise, surprise. They were stuck in traffic until they starved to death. It was just a few headlines that really portrayed this as so dire, and one of them was at CNET. The headline was, "Earth is getting a black box to record events that lead to the downfall of civilization." Well, that may really be exactly what that black box is going to do, and basically what it is it's an obelisk that is going to be put in a remote section of the island of Tasmania, near Australia, with 3-inch thick steel walls, and in it are going to be hard drives that are going to have internet connectivity, and they're going to be recording carbon data and news stories and everything they can that's related to the climate crisis. And the notion is that somebody better do this so that there is some record of this left if human civilization craters.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things about this is the lifespan of this box, or the amount of data that it should be able to collect.
Yeah.
I think it was 30 to 50 years worth.
Mm-hmm. What does that tell you?
We're going to collapse within 50 years.
And if we're following the curves from the limits to growth business as usual scenario, that's about right. It's a very real possibility, and many very smart people are saying it's a very real
likelihood.
Future. Yeah, likelihood. It's going to happen. So
I'm still trying to wrap my head around this. It's frightening to think that is the path that we're going to continue on, even though in my rational mind, I think I believe that. But the project is led by this marketing communications company, Clemminger BBDO, in collaboration with the University of Tasmania, some researchers there. So I guess in my mind, I'm kind of thinking, like, is this a marketing thing? Is this just trying to get attention and enlighten people that we are on this course toward collapse? Or are these researchers saying, like, yep, we believe this is going to happen and we're going to document it, and this is for posterity?
It's a brilliant scheme.
It is.
BBDO is this huge global advertising concern. You want to know, who is their client on this? Is it the University of Tasmania, or is it some rich benefactor? Yeah, because that made it a little suspect that there's a marketing agency as one of the primary partners in this.
Yeah.
Well, time will tell. Anyway, the best news story with a lot of details about this was put out by Australia's ABC News, and we'll put a link in the show notes so that you can read up on it if you're interested.
So it's time for Honey, I Shrunk My Footprint, a regular feature of the podcast in which we each share something of note that we do to shrink our own footprint. It can be a small thing or it can be a big thing.
Well, I have kind of a funky one that just happened to me the other day. We have a cat in the house who used to scratch everything up, but she's getting old, and I guess she's lost the energy to scratch. So we've got these scratching posts that we're getting rid of. So I was getting ready to put a scratching post that was kind of old and ratty and wouldn't be a good reuse item to offer to someone else. So I was going to put it in the trash, but I needed to disassemble it just to fit it in the trash. And in the course of starting to do that, I discovered that there were some parts that would be very good for reusing. There were some really hefty metal angle brackets and some good lag bolts, and there was no reason to put those in the trash. Well, I'm out there at 7:30 in the morning. It's pretty cold, and I hadn't put on a coat because I thought this was going to be quick. Well, there was nothing quick about disassembling this thing. So I spent 25 minutes, and it would have been easy at any point during that time to say, oh, screw it, I'm just going to throw this away and put it on top of the trash can and wheel it out. And I think a lot of people would do that. They would do a cost-benefit analysis. Wow, if it's going to take this much time, it's not that important to me to be able to reuse these bolts and these brackets. But I stayed with it because I thought, you just can't throw this stuff away. And even if I donate these to Habitat for Humanity, there is a good use for them, and new ones won't have to be manufactured. So that was how I shrunk my footprint the other day.
Yeah, that's a great one. Thanks for sharing. So we are recording right before Christmas, which is a holiday that we celebrate in our family. And we've actually spoken in the last few episodes about more sustainable gift giving, giving experiences, that kind of thing. I have a ton of step siblings. I have 7 step siblings total from your remarriage and my mom's remarriage. And so it's always sort of, what do I get all these folks? And so this year I actually decided to make something that is edible and healthy and It's a favorite recipe that I've been making for myself, and I'm excited to share it with my family. So I'm making some homemade granola and putting that in some glass jars and giving that to everyone. So homemade, they can eat it. It's not going to end up in a landfill somewhere. It's hopefully a more sustainable option at the end of the day.
Sounds great. Yep. Won't end up in a storage unit if it doesn't end up in the landfill.
Yep.
Very good. Bravo. Kudos to you for that. Well, if you have an unusual footprint reduction story you want to share, there's no reason why just Stephanie and I should be doing that. So you can email us at podcast@growthbusters.org, or you can call the new listener feedback line and tell us all about it. 719-402-1400. It's dedicated voicemail, and if you call and leave a message on that, you are inherently giving us permission to play your voice on the podcast.
Yeah, and we are so excited to hear from you all. Really looking forward to being able to share our listener feedback in that new format.
Yep. And if you're on your bike or in the car and can't write that down, we'll put that number in the show notes.
And as usual, don't forget to explore issues at growthbusters.org.
And if you think this podcast is important, share the podcast. Hit that share button right now on your iPhone and send that share as a text message to someone you love, or, send it to somebody you elected to represent you in office, or send it to a journalist. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on your podcast app so you don't miss an episode. And these are things you can do to help other people discover limits to growth and the GrowthBusters project.
And if you haven't seen the documentary GrowthBusters Hooked on Growth, it's super easy to find. It's now free. It's on YouTube, and we will link to that in the show notes.
Great. That concludes this test of the emergency limits to growth broadcasting.
Thanks for listening.
Till next time.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some they just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather, but no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling.